Good evening. Samson and I are going to read you a special bedtime story from the Berenstain Bears Big Bedtime book. We're going to read you chapter 1. Are you ready? Here we go. The Berenstain Bears Big Bedtime Book by Stan and Jan Berenstain with Mike Berenstain. Chapter 1. Mama and Papa Bear were going out. The cubs, brother and sister bear, didn't complain. The reason was that their sitter was the one and only Mrs. Grizzle. Mrs. Grizzle could do all kinds of fun things. She was a whiz at tiddlywinks. She could make a cat's cradle with a bit of string, and she could play the piano and yodel. But the cubs' favorite thing about Mrs. Grizzle was her bedtime stories. "Well, what's it going to be tonight?" she asked as she tucked the cubs in. Honey Bear was already asleep in her crib downstairs. Now it was bedtime for brother and sister. "You say," said sister. "Okay," said Mrs. Grizzle. "How about the Three Little Cubs and the Big Bad Pig? I'll wager you've never heard of that one before." "Tell it! Tell it!" cried the cubs. "Once upon a time," began Mrs. Grizzle, "there were 3 little cubs who lived with their mother." "And it was time for them to go out and build houses of their own," said sister. "Exactly," said Mrs. Grizzle. So the first little cub, who was inclined to be rather foolish, said, "Since I love candy, I am going to build my house of candy." "Uh-oh," said brother. "Then I can have candy whenever I want," continued Mrs. Grizzle. Then the second little cub, who was especially fond of cake, said, "I shall build my house of cake. Then I can have cake whenever I want." Cub's brother and sister were all ears. Now that third little cub, who was a sensible sort, said, "I like candy and cake as much as the next fellow, but I hear that the big bad pig has left his garbage dump and is on the prowl." "Dum-de-dum-dum," sang sister. "And not only does the big bad pig have a terrific sweet tooth and terrible eating habits, he's known to have a taste for little cubs. Therefore, I'm going to build my house of logs, good, solid logs." Sister Bear began to look a little worried about what was going to happen, but brother just grinned. So off they went to build their houses. Now, the big bad pig, who was indeed on the prowl, and what a disgusting, garbage-smelling fellow he was, came upon the house of the first little cub. "Yum!" he said. Little cub, let me in, or I'll snuffle and snort and burp your house in." "I bet I know what the little cub is going to say," said sister. "Yeah," said brother. "He's going to say, 'Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin will I open the door and let you in,' right?" "Not by the fur of my chinny chin chin," corrected Mrs. Grizzle. "But hey, maybe you'd like to finish the story." "No, tell it," said sister. Well, anyway, the big bad pig had already eaten his way through the candy wall in the meantime, and was just about to clamp his mighty jaws on the first little cub. "Yipe!" cried the first little cub, and ran as fast as he could to the house of the second little cub, which you'll remember was made of cake. "What kind of cake?" asked sister. "Oh, cupcakes, cinnamon buns, fudge cake, the whole bakery," said Mrs. Grizzle. Well, after the big bad pig gobbled down all the first little cub's entire house of candy, he went to the house of the second little cub. "Open the door and let me in," he roared, "or I'll snuffle and snort and burp your house in." "Not by the fur of my chinny chin chin will I open the door and let you in," said the second little cub. But that old pig had already eaten through the cake wall and was about to snap up the second and the first little cubs in his mighty jaws. "Yipe!" they cried, and they ran to the house of the third little cub, which you'll recall was made of logs. So the big bad pig gobbled down the whole bakery's worth of cake. Now he still had one little cub to go, but he was beginning to feel a little sick. "No wonder," said Sister. "He's eaten a whole house of candy and a whole house of cake. Not to mention," said Brother, "all the garbage he usually ate." So, when he got to the house of the third little cub, he was bent over with an awful bellyache. There was no shouting and demanding to be let in this time. He knocked politely on the door and said, "Sir?" "Yes," said the third little cub. "Please, sir," said the big bad pig, "do you happen to have a stomach remedy in your medicine chest?" "Why, yes, I do," said the third little cub, "but I won't give it to you unless you promise never, ever to bother my brothers and me again." I promise, groaned the big bad pig. So the third little cub pushed a big spoon of gooey pink stomach medicine through the window. Thank you," said the big bad pig as he licked the spoon clean. And he kept his promise. He never, ever bothered the three little cubs again. "That's a pretty good story, Mrs. Grizzle," said Brother. "There's only one trouble with it," said Sister. "It made us hungry." "No problem," said Mrs. Grizzle. "I'll just scoot downstairs for some warm milk and cookies." By the time she got back, the cubs were sound asleep. The end.